Hey everyone, this is Fusion, and this is round five of the FIDE World Chess Championship 2013 between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand. I have Calm, as always, as my co-commentator, well, co-reporter, essentially, as it is after the fact. So, how are you today, Calm?
I'm tired, but I'm ready for this.
You tired?
Yeah.
Well, we've had four draws, and they've been getting better each game. So hopefully, this one will be even better.
Yeah. So Carlsen is white again, and in the last two games we've seen him play Areti with one knight f3. And the second time he varied it up a bit by playing, I think, a c4 on like the third move or something, but still he wasn't really able to achieve much from it.
Okay, so as you can see from the board, it's round S,
It's clearly a 5.
and Carlsen plays one c4.
Okay. So I guess he's kind of given up on the Reti a bit. c4 is a more established opening, I'd say, just in terms of the amount of times it's played at the highest level. But you can also see it transposed into a lot of other lines, including the Reti, which he's played earlier. So it's he's sidestepping some theory by not playing one e4 or d4, but he'll have options to go into them.
E6. Is that a kind of unusual response?
It's basically a response you use if you want to transpose into other openings. It's
I guess so. So if White plays
if White plays
d4,
d4, you can play d5 and get into a Queen's Gambit declined. Or if he plays e4, you can play d5, and you've got some kind of weird French sideline with 2c4, which is played occasionally, but not very often because it's not great. You can also just have, knight f3 or something.
yep. So we do get into this Queen Gambit declined
Yeah.
variation.
So normal Queen's Gambit declined, you'd have 3 knight f6 or 3 bishop e7 here.
Okay. Well, we have c6.
Okay, and so what that does is it actually changes it again. So we're in a semi-Slav, which is actually one of the openings that Anand used a lot in the last World Championship match against Gelfand, I think it was, or possibly even the previous one against Kramnik, which he had a lot of
Seems
success with, yeah.
seems like he can't make up his mind about which opening to go into. So it's just going to go into three different ones.
It's quite, I mean, it's quite tricky in how he's getting into the opening, but it does give Magnus additional options compared to normal, because if you played a normal Slav just after d4, d5, c4, c6, after knight c3, you'd see knight f6 most of the time, before e6, because it leaves you with options to move your bishop open, and that prevents like some sidelines that Magnus can go into now with, for example, 3e4 is some line which I think is actually played in the game, and that's one of the lines that could have been prevented with a different opening move order. So
Yeah.
that could have just been preparation on Carlsen's part. He's
What opening is it if Black plays bishop b4 instead of c6?
instead of c6.
Yeah.
Um, well, it will transpose into either a Nimzo Indian or a
Nimzo.
Bogo Indian, but yeah, it's one of the variations where Black plays d5, because usually in the Nimzo Indian you eventually play some c5 or d5 break.
Yeah.
So basically it's a line where they play d5, they just do it later, and you've just played it earlier here.
Yeah, because I think I used to play the Nimzo like ages ago.
Yeah, I played it a bit, but
So I thought it looked a little familiar, but not quite.
yeah, if you had knight f6 and bishop b4 in here, as well as like knight f3 and e3, it would be basically a Nimzo.
Okay, so yeah, e4.
So
And
e4 is much rarer than e3, which is the normal move, but
looks kind of aggressive, trying to take control.
yeah. But I think it's also a way that Magnus knows you can sidestep a lot of theory, and the line itself is not meant to give a huge amount to white.
Okay, well,
He'll
yeah,
just get an open position where he can.
that is Carlsen style.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
choose the worst opening.
Well, it's not that he'd be worse, but he
Have less of an advantage.
yeah, or at least that's what most of the top grandmasters would think, which is why they prefer the other move.
Yeah. So knight takes, and then bishop e4 check.
Yeah, so here actually, it's an important point because the most common move here, I think by far, but it's actually I can't remember the name of it, but it's a gambit line. And basically, the main move here is bishop d2, and it's
Yeah.
a pawn sacrifice after this. So black's up a pawn, and basically white is compensation based on he's got the bishop across this diagonal. But this would have been really interesting to go into. As it is, Magnus plays a different sideline, but this is meant to not give enough. Well, it gives enough to white for a draw, but black's been holding easily enough in this line. But this is the main kind of thing that I think the commentators were expecting after bishop b4 check.
Well, clearly, if they were expecting that, they hadn't taken note of the last 4 rounds. Don't think Carlsen was going to go into that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a tied score at this point in the game, so maybe Magnus could, you could argue that he was getting frustrated with that, but I definitely think if he's going into a tactical line, he's playing into Anand's strengths, whereas if he plays a more positional, slower game, it tends to work for him.
Like here with knight c3.
Yeah.
And then c5, so it's kind of Nimzo-esque.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be similar. The reason you play c5 is just because you want the c6 square open for your knight, so you can develop kind of normally. And also if you get rid of the d4 pawn, then you can push e5 later and get your bishop out. Or maybe you want to play b6 and bishop e7 and get your bishop out that way, and c5 is also helpful there. Yeah.
Okay, so a3, and then bishop back. Okay.
You could take on c3 also there. It's kind of just personal preference. Obviously, white can't play b4 here because of the pawn on c5, so that's kind of the difference. But if white were to be greedy and just like grab the pawn on c5, you get this line, which is white's up material, but he's got triple pawns, and it doesn't really do anything for him. You could play quick bishop d7 and c6, and then knight d7, and you'd regain at least one of those pawns quickly. And I'd rather take this position as black, to be honest.
Well, I take white here. got to love triple pawns.
Triple pawns on the c-file, which is completely isolated, so you can't protect any of them with a pawn.
That's fine. I'd take that. No problems.
Okay.
I guess you're getting them all back anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, if you get one back, it's even, but if you get more than one back, which I think is quite likely long term, black's in a good position.
Okay, let's carry on. So knight f3, which is standard. Knight f6, bishop e3. Okay, I'm just going to carry on because these look all kind of developing normal moves, unless they've got some strange positional aspects to them, which you want to talk about. I'll carry on.
Well, basically, I think the next move Magnus plays is queen d3, if I remember. Yeah, and this was a novelty, I think. In all the other games where this has been seen previously, white had always taken on c5 now, after they've played the bishop to e3 and could protect that c5 pawn a bit more. But the way Magnus plays this here with queen d3 is... his idea is just keep the pawn structure a bit more solid, and also allows a very quick long castling if he wants it.
And also, I guess he's not so worried about trading queens. I think he prefers those kind of positions anyway. And if he does, then he gets his bishop out onto d3, which is a nice square. So in lines where the queens come off, then it's okay for him.
Yeah, I think also if he manages to do that quick long castles, and he can take back with the queen on d3 with the rook, He'd also like that line because then he'd have a lot of control over the d file, and he'd count that as some small advantage as well.
So, takes on d4, knight takes d4, then knight g4.
See, knight g4 to me looked a bit weird when I saw it in the game. Just because we're not fully developed yet. But I guess his idea is he wants to quickly trade off the, bishop on e3 and just kind of simplify the material down a bit, because it does look like if he can get the material off, then it's going to be a draw, because there's not really any pawn tension at any point. And if he manages to take on e3 and white has to recapture with the pawn structure is a bit messed up for white, which could potentially help in an endgame. On the other hand, you do spend, time to play knight g4, and you haven't finished your development yet, so pluses and minuses.
So, quick queenside castling for Magnus here, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it looks aggressive, and it kind of is, and it's also a way to take advantage of the quick knight move. You're just, making your moves faster, you're ahead in development, which might count for something, but I would imagine we'll see takes on e3 here, because that's consistent with the plan of playing knight g4, which you don't.
Now what do you take back with there? The queen or the f-pawn?
I mean, I think you'd like to take back with the queen, and you also open up discoveries from your rook on his queen, but I think then maybe bishop b6 is annoying, kind of pinning your queen against that knight, but then you can get... I'd say you can get complications with knight takes c6 attacking his queen, but unfortunately then you have bishop b6 takes on e3, which is the queen with check, which kind of messes those things up, so I think maybe he has to take back with the pawn. I think ideally we'd take with the queen though, just to keep our pawn structure a bit better.
Yeah, so he does take with the f-pawn. I guess it does open up the f-file. That's one plus.
Yeah, and also although I comment about the pawn structure, it's not really a factor until you get to the late game, so I don't think he'll be concerned at the moment.
So bishop c7
goes back,
and then takes on c6.
Yeah, that's one interesting thing about bishop c7. It just gives Magnus this option of going to this endgame, and although he's got that isolated pawn on e3, black's now going to get one on c6. So he has two bishops, but he can't really utilise his light squared one, because it's going to be blocked by his own pawn, or the c4 pawn, or the e6 pawn. So it's, I'd say you have white having a slight advantage, even though he doesn't have the two bishops. So he can play a quick bishop e2 to f3, take advantage of that backwards c6 pawn, and you can get in a position where you think white has a good knight against a bad bishop, because after queen takes queen from white, obviously you have to recapture with the bishop, and the bishop's on d8, and you have time to play knight e4 as well. Then you can threaten knight coming into d6 or c5, and both look slightly better for white, I think.
Okay.
So I think this is what we see in the game, so...
Yeah.
With the option of knight e4 there immediately, or this bishop e2 kind of thing. I think bishop e2 is better than bishop d3 as well in this position, because we don't want to block our rook on d1.
Yeah, king e7. I guess he decides the quickest way is to get his king into the game. Doesn't want a castle. Now that the queen's off the board, he's just going to play a quick king move towards the middle, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, in endgames you want your king near the centre, and I think the d8 square can be quite useful to trade all the rooks or something, to get rid of white's control of the d-file. After something like bishop c7 and the other bishop move, you can play the rooks to d8, whereas if you castle you don't really have that option, because the bishop stops it. What this does mean is you can't play anything like bishop f6 or bishop g5, which could have been other tempting options, I think.
Yeah, because that e3 pawn looks pretty alone.
Pretty alone and tasty. But then
Look,
again, you could argue that knight e4 could win tempo on that bishop, and if you play just rook d3 to protect it, you're also helping double on the d-file, so it's probably why I decided for this instead.
I guess you got things like bishop b6, which do the same thing.
Yep. And it may be advisable actually to play that quite quickly, because I think if we allow this knight e4 plan, then he can play c5 to counter a lot of those kind of things.
Of course, first he must deal with this c6 problem, I guess, by playing a bishop move to defend it.
Yeah, I think Carlsen's move was accurate there with bishop f3 first, because it's obviously with kind of tempo on that c6 pawn, so it forces the bishop to a place, and then he can do some knight maneuver, I think.
Yep, like this. Although he plays it anyway, which is interesting.
I mean, personally, if you were to say that this was done purely for this attack on e3, I'd say that this move was done incorrectly, because basically the timing it allows the c5 move. Anand has something different in mind, but if white were to have some free moves and he could play c5, then the bishop goes somewhere, and then he can play knight d6, I think this is just going to be a really pleasant position for white to play, just kind of small edge thing. So if you were to play, say, bishop c7 instead of f5, then you'd play something like knight d6, and it would just be really awkward to deal with for black. We'd just slowly look to double our rooks and have control over that d-file, and it's awkward for black to deal with it, because he can only put one rook on the d-file, and if he ever plays bishop takes d6, we just take back by the rook, and we'd have extra pressure on c6, and again we'd be threatening to double, and basically everything would just get tied down. And once that's happened, we then have the option of doing some slow plan, like walking the king up and playing, you know, a4, b4, b5, and then pushing c6, where we've got the support of that rook on d6. So it's just kind of slow push plan, which would be very annoying for Anand to deal with. It's not necessarily winning for white, but white would certainly have all the play in the position, and he'd have good chances at making something happen, I think.
I agree, but he does have this f5 move, which complicates things somewhat. So does he take? Yes, he does. Okay.
Yeah, so I think f5 is definitely the plan when Anand played bishop b6, because otherwise I think bishop b6 was, you know, incorrectly played. The only potential miscalculation could maybe be this b7 move that Magnus has.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is quite a cute in-between move, because without it, if we just say bishop takes e4 instead of b7, then black just recaptures here, he's solved his pawn problems, and this is going to be a draw most likely, because they only have one isolated pawn each and they're both on the e-file, so this is very hard to make anything happen here.
Yep. Okay, so Magnus doesn't want Vichy to solve his pawn problems. He wants to give him one extra thing to worry about.
Yeah.
The addict that he is. And oops, I'm just playing it. Playing like I would play. Yeah, so rook a b8.
Yeah, so we're just going to take that pawn, but we're not going to have the ideal pawn structure. So Magnus has a tiny edge here, just based on that.
Yeah, you got four pawn islands against 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which, and you got, although you do have bishop on d7, which is basically a massive pawn.
Yeah, but that can potentially come to life later, and it's not necessarily bad there, because, you know, when you move it, it'll support that square, and then we can play something to d7. At the moment, it's important because it defends c6, of course.
I mean, at first glance, it looks quite drawish, this position.
Yeah, and I think it is. I think if you put it in an engine and it played till infinity, it would be a draw like, I don't know, 80-90% of the time, maybe more. But because he has that small weakness here, it just gives him something to press on later in the game. And basically, for Carlsen, that means I'm playing on this position forever.
So Carlsen goes for the F file.
Mm-hmm.
And Rook B5. Okay.
So it gets out of the pin from C6, and also you can move it along that 5th rank.
Yeah, you can do many things. This is quite flexible. You got Rook HB8 ideas. Just, you know, getting up B2, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the awkward thing about that for white is if he ever pushes his pawns to try and, get rid of that, then we can push C5 and get rid of our pawn weakness.
Yeah.
So generally, well, not generally, but basically white would try and deal with that with just doubling his own rooks on the 2nd rank. Defend across that way, I think. Maybe bishop C2 and B3 could be one option. Also with rook B5 you have the option of rook E5 for black and rook H5, both just slowly tying white up a bit. So rook F4 was played, and I think this was a slight error because basically it allows black to play G5 with tempo. I think maybe rook D4 would have been basically doing the same thing, but without that G5 option with tempo, or at least that's what I remember from the commentary at the time. Seemed to give away basically his advantage, and after this, they generally thought it was. I think the computer thought it was dead even. So, because rook F3 is kind of forced because rook E5 is coming next. So if you played rook D4, you wouldn't have got into this trouble essentially.
She goes for H5, just being quite aggressive with his pawns.
Yeah, also it helps just to get that pawn off H7 so he can move his other rook based on the bishop attack from E4.
So now, the rook swings across. He has to be careful of his F7 square, but it's not really the end of the world.
Yeah, I think just bishop E8 seems to cover a lot of the problem squares. And that's probably what he plays here. I can't really see what else.
What happens if he does something else like this? And what's the big deal about checking me? Why just run away?
Yeah, I think that maybe the problem would be something like you just move a rook along to, say, G7 or H7. So if you move it to H7, then we're attacking a pawn here, and then we're threatening the rook to something like this, which can be kind of awkward. Probably we'd first deal with B2, like protect it somehow. But maybe just getting a rook into the 7th rank is annoying because it's hard to defend from behind this H pawn, basically.
Yeah, okay.
So maybe we just play rook F2 instead of rook F7, and then it's awkward to do something with H5 pawn.
Okay, well, bishop E8 was played, so making sure everything's fine there. And then the bishop comes back to C2, I guess, with the intention of playing B3 if it's ever needed.
Mm-hmm. Also, just getting out the way of the E pawn. So if after rook E5, for example, we can we don't have to worry about keeping our rook on F3 to protect T3 anymore.
Yep, this kind of position with lots of isolated pawns, you have to be quite tricky. You have to be quite careful about different things because they can come under attack at any point, essentially. Or worse, if they're connected, then they can protect each other.
Yeah.
So it has to be careful. So now rook c5, just pinning white down. Okay, fair enough. And now rook f6. I mean, it's kind of strange move. Well, I don't know if it's strange necessarily, but
Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of prevents bishop g6 a bit, but then again, bishop g6 wouldn't have been the biggest threat in the world because we could have, countered that with our own rook to f2, for example. But I guess I think it is basically just against bishop g6. What he's doing is just taking moves away from black, and he's in no real pressure to move it, so he can just kind of keep it there. And maybe in the future you can get something like bishop b3 in to put pressure on the e6 pawn.
Okay, so h4, I guess giving black some space for his bishop.
Yep.
And come for h5 now if he wants to.
Can also play h3 in the future if he wants to just get his pawns further on.
So it's a useful move that. So it's still now e4, putting the pawn in the way of his bishop.
Yeah, so that seems counterintuitive, but I think what his plan is here is that he's actually trying to get it to e5 at some point. And if you can get it there, then that f6 and d6 square will be kind of locked up, and that's that would be a point where white can kind of work an advantage from. Like if he can get his pawn on e5 and get it protected, then he can play stuff like bishop b3 and highlight pressure on e6.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to get that pawn on e5 though.
Yeah, I think really the only way you can do it whilst keeping your rook on f6 is via the king. So you'd have to play like king d2 and then look for bishop e3 and king e3 to king d4 or something like that.
That looks quite complicated.
Yeah, or well then again, even if you play king d2, bishop d3, and then you play like b4, there's not that many squares for the rook actually. Pretty much only e5, and then king d4 would obviously actually trap the rook at that point. So yeah, it's ambitious, but it's a slow position, and it's hard for black to do too much, so you could be thinking along those lines anyway.
So what's the deal with this a5?
I think that a5 is maybe against that kind of plan, because now if he plays b4, at least he's trading off one of his isolated pawns, and he's getting rid of, white's 2 down to an isolated pawn himself, but that's probably the only motivation behind it, because it's a slow position, there's not too much else that black's really doing.
Okay, so king d2, that's kind of what you suggested.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's totally doing it for that e5 plan, but his other pieces are in good positions, and he wants to get out of that pin, I guess.
So rook b5 now, trying to force the king back to defend b2.
Or b3, either way.
Or b3, which is played, works as well. Of course, now it's a little. Got to be careful. It doesn't become too weak.
Yeah, that's the thing, because the plan I mentioned would be nice, but it assumes that black has no moves. I think actually this h4 move, like you said, was opening up space for this bishop, and now it kind of opens up black's other rook, which was otherwise very hard to utilize. So white's got to be wary about black's attack as well. Bishop h5 is obviously just a much better square than e8 now that c6 doesn't need to be defended, because he's still defending f7, but also he's got attacking potential along that diagonal, and he kind of covers d1 as well if he ever wants to use the d-file himself.
So here comes the king, slowly making his way to the middle of the board, and okay.
Yeah, but now this check is awkward because we can't obviously go to d4 because c2 would hang, so we're kind of forced back. And he actually decides to put his king on b2, which is obviously safer now that the d-file is available for black. But it seems like his plan was just a little slow there, and black's got more than enough compensation. He's got that rook on c5 still, and I
Yeah,
think black is at least equal here.
yeah, black's doing fine. It looks like to me.
Yeah.
White has spent quite a lot of time to get his king all the way back round
Yeah.
to b2. But Celebi. So rook d8 now, just bringing the other rook into the game. So I guess White will have to relocate his f rooks because they don't seem to be doing so much. Because with f7 being covered by the bishop, it seems to be difficult to continue for White. Let's see what he does. Just guarding c2.
Yeah, because I guess the threat was rook d2
d2.
after rook d8. But I mean, it's kind of interesting in that. Well, I guess you can't. I was going to say that black could play rook d2 anyway, and after takes you could take on f6. But actually you could play rook takes e6 check first, and you'd win a pawn in that variation.
Yeah, that is correct. So now rook d4.
Yeah, so the only thing you got to be worried about here is what for black this is well, I mean, you don't really have to be worried about anything. I was going to say the rook's along the h file or something, but that's still protected by g5, and your rook on c5 covers g5, so it's not really an issue at all.
I guess so.
I guess after rook d4, one of the plans might be a4 from black. Yeah.
So obviously, rook moves across, bishop has to come over here. It's like, well, it's not the only square, but it's probably a good square. Well, I don't know, actually. Is it the best square? Probably.
I'm not sure, but this way kind of ensures the trading down of more material.
Although it does release control of the f7 square, which was kind of
it does
tying White up.
So again, it's pluses and minuses. I think okay. So I said ensures trade there, but actually I forgot that you played this. So yeah, Magnus by playing this, I think is showing that he still wants to play on, and obviously he didn't really have a great way to take, because if he takes and takes, it's I don't really see him doing anything with this game, because the doubling on the f rook, you could just meet with rook e5 or something, and then king d6 and c5. White king can never get into the center. E4 could hang.
Yeah, e4 is hanging if he trades. So
yeah.
So what does he play here? Yep, rook b5, just attacking b3, which is very nice, I guess. The bishop. Oh. Okay, so he defends the b3 pawn indirectly by attacking d4. So
it's clever, but I mean, it's kind of put black in an awkward spot by going for this, and he may not have considered king c3 so much. Because now when you play e5, which seems like the most natural, or c5, either they do the same thing, just to protect that rook, it means that your coverage of g5 is inhibited, because you've got your own pawn in the way, so it's very awkward to defend that going forwards, because you can't just play c4 to protect it again, because that rook would hang, obviously. So maybe this isn't the best, but this is where we kind of see the awkwardness of having White's rooks kind of in our base as such. I mean, we were threatening rook takes b3 there immediately, which is obviously a much more pressing threat than the g5 pawn. So I'm just thinking ahead to what I remember from the game.
Yep, okay, so rook b2 is defending. I guess now you've got to work out how to continue here for black.
So, I mean, a4 is one plan.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. So on a4,
you could basically just get the trade of everything. I mean, if he plays
b4,
well,
he has to do b4, because if he takes, then that's going to be okay for
Yeah, this is obviously going to be, fine for black, because even if we lose g5, we'll win e4.
Yeah. So b4 is the critical line, and then, well, you can't take with the c5 pawn because it's defending the rook on d4.
Yeah.
So probably you'll want to play something like e5 to.
So e5 would work, because obviously if we take on c5 and you take back with the rook, and actually that's checkmate.
That would be mate.
So yeah, we probably shouldn't take on c5 there. And yeah, well, that looks good enough, obviously. So I guess White couldn't take there, but now he has the situation where he doesn't necessarily need to do anything. He could play like bishop d3 or something, like push away that black rook. Maybe.
But you can do a check, right?
Yeah, but we can, I think, just take back
With
anything. I think probably the rook, I guess.
king takes doesn't work.
Okay. with the rook then.
Okay, then we play that. And then we can do
And
this.
then we can take. But then maybe this is. I mean, I just don't think the a pawn's going to do anything, because we can play rook a6. Is essentially my idea. And I think this is going to be a draw.
Yeah, okay. I'll take a draw.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what was played. Okay, so e5 first.
So, okay, so maybe he wants to play c4 instead, in which case he needs that e pawn move first to protect the rook. But of course now you have this plan, and it's somewhat awkward to deal with, because you can play g4 here to protect it via the bishop, but
Okay.
then just rook back to h6, and that pawn's going to fall instead. So there's no real gain to that, so I think that's why Anand just goes on with his own kind of attack with the a4 move. But I would argue that if you're playing a4, why did you play e5 last move? Because as we saw, we could have. Well, yeah, but you hadn't played rook g6 yet.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's kind of like White's got that attack for free, and you would have had time to do something about it maybe, or take at least force White into playing that b4 move like we looked at.
So, yeah, Magnus just takes, and he has to be careful because e5 is hanging now.
Yeah, which it wouldn't have been in the other line.
So rook takes, and now. Oh, this doesn't look.
So, I mean, he gained a pawn back on b3, but he's lost the e5 pawn as well. So he's still going to be a pawn down in this position. He's got a better rook. Well, I'd say he's got a better combined pieces position with his rook and his bishop, whilst this pawn is on e4. But, obviously he is a pawn down now, so.
Yep, king d6 only move to defend that c5 pawn. And now he's just going to come swing across to h5, attack the other pawn. And
so
it's difficult for black to progress here because his rook is kind of tied up. I mean, the only move he's got essentially is rook d1, right?
Well, yeah, I think rook d1. Obviously, you can't play bishop c2 because we'd have rook c1 and we'd win.
Yeah.
So he has to play bishop d3, and then I think maybe rook a1. Well, okay. So I think he plays e5 in the game.
Yeah.
Because we just went forwards one. So obviously we do some move, and then the bishop moves. But this e5 move I think is important, because otherwise his only move would have been bishop d3, and then I think after just rook a1 to pick up the a pawn, there'd be no way for White to do anything about that, because we could just play rook a2 check if king b2 and still pick up that a pawn. Whereas here we've got this bishop move all the way to the back, and now it's threatening bishop g8 check to trade off the b3 bishops, which would mean that he can hang on to that a pawn, which could prove important.
Yeah. So how about here? He just goes for this rook a1 plan. I mean, anyway, because after the check, you move the king out of the way somewhere. Takes. You can just do this.
Yeah, I think this is the best, and I think this is what the commentators were saying after, and this pretty much seems like a draw because it's even material, and even though h4 my 4 were, the a pawn is very strong essentially, so because we can play king b5 here to protect a4, and then, well, I mean, maybe here rook e4 would be something to just push that pawn, because it's quite awkward to get back, but so we could play rook e3 or something instead and just take off that pawn maybe. That would be, it looks pretty much like a draw. So yeah, I mean, here I guess the most accurate would probably be, instead of taking on e5, we actually play rook e2 check and take the g pawn, because then those two pawns are separated, and that's going to be a draw. Because now we can take the h pawn as well, so yeah.
Do 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 do.
So yeah, king d6, and this is a draw. Well, that one might not be that.
There we go.
Okay, yeah, exactly as how would be played. We have a draw. But in the game we had this rook c1 move, which I think was supposedly the big blunder.
So it's, well, spoilers. So king b2 stops him coming to a1.
Yeah.
So now he decides to go for these g pawns. So of course here he's losing a pawn. Oops, I was expecting a trade, but he wants to check first. Okay, fine.
Yeah, because you can force the king back an extra square, so it's just a useful check.
Yeah. So now when you take, you lose that pawn on the queen side. I guess you get this one back, but then Carlsen gets this one, so now you're 2 pawns down. Yeah. And this is not looking good.
I mean, basically, if you can get into an endgame and you've got this but 1 pawn less, then it's always going to be a draw. If you have the A and E pawns against your C pawn and a rooks each, it's still going to be a draw. If you have the E and H pawns and the rooks against the C pawn, it's still going to be a draw. So the only real way that Magnus can win this is if he has the A and H pawns still on the board, like both of them, and he can give away the E pawn, but he can't lose either of the other ones. So by basically allowing this situation of moves instead of taking off white's A pawn, he's basically given this endgame where Magnus has chances to win compared to chances he wouldn't really have otherwise.
So let's see how Vishy tries to defend. So king e6, and then he's pushing that pawn.
Yeah, so what was really interesting here is that the obvious move to play instead of a4 would have been rook h5, just to protect his e pawn. But actually it seems that that then allows king d5 in enough time to whereby he'd be able to get back to the a pawn and defend it.
Yeah, it's all about the square that you need.
Yeah, so a4 is actually a really strong move because it allows him to push this a pawn further on, and if the e pawn was taken, he wouldn't really have enough time to go back after both.
Yeah, because if you take here, then you can
exactly
this kind of thing.
Yeah, and then you just put your rook on the 7th.
Oh yeah.
and then you just push your H pawn, and your king is, it's able to mop up the C pawn easily.
Okay, that was kind of a rough thing. So let's see what happens in game. Oh, yeah, this is a bit more accurate. Stop the king coming to the 7th.
Yeah. Okay. So he did take the E pawn, and this is basically what it showed, but the more accurate version is the actual game continuation. So obviously, by playing to the 7th immediately, king c6, king d5 is basically the same thing because it takes the same amount of time to kind of do anything, but it's awkward. So he goes to d5 to be able to play this check and go king c5, but it's...
Can put the rook behind, just trying to defend, but after a7 now, he has to bring his king back, but then
this pawn comes along.
Yeah, the pawn comes along, so, well, I don't know what he's doing there. Don't go that way.
Well, yeah, but, what can he do? Because he's never going to be able to put his king on the 7th rank to protect a8, which will mean that he's not able to stop that pawn now that it's on the 7th rank.
I mean, he can't do anything like this because, take it.
Yeah, he doesn't have enough time to get back.
This king is a little far away from the rook. It's a little far away. So, he just then resigns after this move, which is the first decisive game of this World Championships.
It is. And it goes to Carlsen. It's after his third white game.
The Wonder Kid goes ahead. Well, I say one love, but it's not really, is it? It's like 3-2.
3-2 at the moment, yeah, because half a point for a draw and 1 point for a win. So, yeah, he's taken the lead, and I do think that Anand had even play for most of that game, and he had some relatively simple chances to draw with like the rook a1 or like not giving the g pawn somehow. But as it is, Carlsen just pushed with these tiny edges, and he managed to make something happen, which he's very good at doing.
He had quite a bit of time still left, so that's a little strange. Still got 10 minutes at this point, so perhaps he could have thought about it a bit more.
Maybe
before going into that.
I do remember watching the after-match interview, and he said, yeah, maybe he could have played better at points, but he just thought it would be an easy draw. So I think he just kind of miscalculated, and as I said a little bit ago, it's just because he's able to get this A and H pawns, it basically means that the king can't cover both sides of the board at once, whereas if it was, either of the other options where he still had the E pawn, he'd have been able to cover the distance between them, to essentially cover the promotion at the end, which makes all the difference.
Yep. I think even in this position, I could beat Vichy here. Yep. That's white. So when it comes to that point, definitely should resign. Yeah. Okay. First win. Let's see how many decisive games there are in this championship series.
Yeah, I mean, if we think back to the last World Championship against Gelfand, Anand lost the first game there, but then he came right back and won the next one, and he will have white, so, we'll see how he manages to do.
Yep. Okay, good point to leave it there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on this LNB coverage of the FIDE World Championship Series. Thanks.